Kure Harbor, Japan, October 8th, 1970, 4:17. The Pacific is a sheet of black glass, fractured only by the running lights of the heavy lift ship Takagawa. The air is cold, smelling of salt and diesel, of anticipation and rust. Aboard the ship, a manufactured silence hangs thick, a collective holding of breath broken by the low, hydraulic groan of winches stirring to life, a sound felt in the sternum before it is heard by the ear. Powerful spotlights spear the clinging darkness, their beams converging on a patch of ink-black water, creating a circle of shimmering mercury on the surface. There is no crowd, no ceremony. Just the quiet, monumental tension of men in oilskins preparing to violate a grave, their faces etched in the stark relief of the industrial lights. A diver's voice, thin and crackling over a radio, confirms the final connections from the world below. All lines secure. She is ready to come home. The phrase is professional, yet it hangs in the air with a terrible, poetic weight. The winch drums turn, engaging with a deep, metallic shriek that tears the morning apart. Cables, thick as ancient tree trunks, tense, shed a waterfall of phosphorescent droplets, and go rigid with a stress that hums through the entire vessel. And slowly, impossibly, the sea begins to boil. A turbulence from the depths, a great sighing eruption of bubbles, and then the first glimpse, a curve of black, streaming weed and water, rising from the abyss like the back of a slumbering beast. The sea is giving up its secret, but it is a reluctant surrender. What emerged from that primordial dark was not merely steel, nor a simple artifact of war. It was a ghost. A 1,000-ton specter from an empire that had evaporated into history, from a cataclysm that had burned its ideology to ash and redrawn the map of the world in fire and radiation. This was Turret No. 3 of the IJN Mutsu, once the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a name whispered with reverence and fear. Alongside her sister ship, Nagato, the Mutsu represented the zenith of Japanese naval ambition in the anxious interwar years, a 39,000-ton Congo-class battleship, later rebuilt into a towering behemoth, a floating citadel designed to project imperial power across the vastness of the Pacific. Her very name, derived from an ancient Japanese province, evoked a mythic, unassailable strength, a connection to a timeless, sacred soil. She was conceived in the strained diplomatic theater of the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, a delicate document intended to curtail an arms race by imposing limits. Japan, assigned a lower tonnage ratio than Britain or the United States, perceived it as a slight, a Western imposition. The Mutsu's survival on the drawing board was a feat of political wrangling. Her completion became an act of nationalistic defiance, a statement that Japan would not be contained. For the young men who walked her teak decks, she was a leviathan of their modern age, a mountain of polished steel and intricate machinery that hummed with the soul of Yamato. She was the embodiment of Kaka, the nation-state, and Kadu, the imperial way. Her 9 16-inch guns, housed in 3 mighty turrets, were not just weapons. They were the articulated voice of the emperor, capable of speaking in thunder across 20 miles of open ocean. And on a quiet, overcast June afternoon in 1943, while anchored in the placid, supposedly impregnable inland sea of Hiroshima Bay, stone's throw from the sacred homeland, the Mutsu was torn apart from within by a cataclysmic internal explosion. The forward magazine detonated with a violence that sundered the great ship in two, just forward of Turret No. 3. She sank in minutes, her bow and stern rising toward the sky in a final, grotesque salute before sliding beneath the waves, taking over 1,000 of her crew, from admirals to teenage cooks, into the cold embrace of the seabed. The official cause, delivered by a shaken and secretive board of inquiry, pointed to a single devastating human fracture, the despair of a young sailor, a rating named Motoshiro Terumi, who, burdened by shame or madness, was said to have deliberately ignited a powder magazine. But in the shadows of the shattered fleet, other whispers circulated like a slow, toxic current. Whispers of defective Type 3 Sanshikidan anti-aircraft shells, of volatile propellant batches, of rushed production in overextended arsenals, of fatal flaws hidden in the Empire's straining industrial heart. The wreck settled in 130 feet of water, a designated war grave, a monument to shocking failure, and, as the decades turned, a tantalizing repository of a rare commodity, pre-1945 low-background steel. The crew of the Mutsu had expected a different ascent. They had imagined soaring on the crest of imperial destiny, their mighty ship leading the victorious charge of the combined fleet. They were the guardians of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a Japanese-led order that promised liberation from Western colonialism, but which, in reality, delivered a far crueler, more extractive subjugation. They expected to see their technological marvel, her pagoda mast a stark silhouette against the tropical sky, her main batteries roaring in synchronized fury, dictate terms across the Coral Sea, the Philippine Sea, the very shores of America. They expected a warrior's death, if death must come, in a climactic Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle against the encroaching American fleet, a concept drilled into them like a religious doctrine. Their daily lives were a rhythm of exacting drills, of polishing brass under a pitiless sun, of studying complex firing solutions, all underpinned by the unshakable belief in the spiritual superiority of the Japanese fighting man, a superiority they believed was encased and amplified by this masterpiece of naval architecture. Instead, their collective experience was one of sudden, intimate, and meaningless obliteration. Not in a heroic, cinematic jewel of titans beneath a stormy sky, but at anchor in a calm harbor amidst the gentle, green hills of their homeland. The explosion that claimed them was not an enemy shell screaming in from the horizon, but a fire born in the belly of their own ship. It was a betrayal by the very machinery of their power, a violent punctuation, mark on the crumbling narrative of Japanese invincibility that had already been cracked at Midway. There was no enemy to curse, no glorious last stand. One moment, the familiar world of humming generators, the smell of miso soup from the galley, the chatter of men. The next, an instant of atomizing light and pressure, then the sucking chaos of cold water, fuel oil, and screams. It was death as administrative error, as industrial accident, a grotesque parody of the Gyukusai, the shattered jewel, honorable death they had been prepared for. A quarter-century later, the men of the salvage ship Takagawa also approached the site with their own set of expectations. For them, this was a straightforward, if Herculean, engineering feat, a lucrative contract from the Nippon Steel Corporation to raise valuable low-background steel. This metal, forged before the first atomic bomb showered the planet with radioactive isotopes, was priceless for sensitive scientific instruments, Geiger counters, gamma-ray spectrometers, medical scanners. It was a commodity, and the Mutsu was a mine. They expected technical challenges, fierce currents, tangled debris, the immense weight of the turret. They expected to find a wreck. They did not expect to be grave robbers, underwater archaeologists of trauma, and unwitting participants in the final, ironic act of the Pacific War's long, lingering aftermath. They did not anticipate the psychological weight of handling objects still resonant with the echoes of their owners, of working in a space where the personal and the historical had been frozen in a violent instant. The facts of the Mutsu's end are recorded in the terse, shocked logbooks of nearby vessels, entries that struggled to maintain professional detachment in the face of the incomprehensible. The IJN Yawata Maru, a repair ship anchored close by, recorded, at 12:13, observed sudden red flash amidships on Mutsu, column of dark smoke, estimated 1,000 meters, followed by two distinct secondary explosions approximately 30 seconds later. Ship appeared to break in two forward of turret No. 3. Bow and stern sections rose vertically, proceeded immediately to render assistance. The destroyer Tamanami rushed to the scene, her log noting the sea covered in thick fuel oil, debris, and non-swimming survivors. The subsequent Board of Inquiry's findings, sealed for years, pointed to that specific human tragedy. The official conclusion was probable deliberate ignition of the No. 3 rear magazine by a person in that vicinity, with the finger pointed at Motoshiro Tarumi, a crewman reportedly distressed over a lost item of equipment for which he would be held financially responsible. The case was closed with the neat, devastating logic of a scapegoat. Yet, the data recovered from the wreck itself, and from survivor testimonies gathered in the years after the war, complicates this neat narrative. Survivor accounts like that of Petty Officer Kikuo Matsumoto, published in a 1965 memoir, noted strange, unsettling maintenance issues in the days prior. There was concern about the temperature in No. 3 turret's lower handling room. It felt wrong, closer to the boil than was safe. We reported it. But the orders from above were to ready the ammunition for a scheduled inspection. The new Type 3 shells from the Kurihama arsenal had just been loaded. They made some of the older hands nervous. The salvage operation of 1970 provided its own silent forensic testimony. When the turret was raised and inspected by marine engineers, they documented the twisted, pedaled metal around the barbette, the armored cylinder connecting the turret to the magazine below. The blowout patterns suggested a pressure wave that had multiple points of intense origin, not a single central ignition. The steel itself told a story of immense instantaneous heat. Furthermore, the operation became an archaeological dig. Each haul brought up not just inert steel, but artifacts suspended in time, a sake cup, its ceramic fused to a melted section of bulkhead in a vitrified kiss. An officer's pocket watch, its hands forever arrested at 12:13, its crystal milky with the patina of decades. A single leather shoe, perfectly placed, as if its owner had just stepped out of it. Pages from a technical manual, their ink bleached but words still faintly visible, pressed into a solid, sedimentary block by 27 years of immense pressure. These objects were the true data points, the silent testimonials that stood in mute contradiction to the simple official story of a lone saboteur. They whispered of a more complex systemic truth, of a war machine stretched beyond its limits, of quality control sacrificed for quantity, of pressures both metallurgical and psychological bubbling beneath the surface of imperial discipline. The raising of the turret was, in itself, a form of historical cross-examination. The slow dripping ascent of turret No. 3 from its seabed tomb transformed the Mutsu from a singular cautionary tale of imperial overreach into a universal symbol of transference and repurposing. Japan in 1970 was a nation reborn in the white heat of an economic miracle. The ideology of militaristic expansion had been utterly incinerated at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and in its place rose a relentless, pacifist mercantilism codified in Article 9 of its new constitution. The salvage steel of the Mutsu did not journey to a foundry to be reborn as tanks or guns. It was sold, kilogram by precious kilogram, to scientific institutions across the globe, to universities in Europe, to research labs in America. Physicists prized its pre-Hiroshima purity, its freedom from cobalt-60 and other ambient radionuclides that bathed all post-1945 steel. This metal, born in the fiery forges of the 1930s for the explicit purpose of projecting violent power, was reborn in the sterile clean rooms of the late 20th century in the service of pure knowledge and human health. It became part of the shielding for sensitive particle detectors probing the secrets of the universe. It was fashioned into components for whole-body counters used to measure radiation exposure in patients. The very essence of the Empire's shattered strength, the high-quality nickel-steel armor plate that was meant to keep American shells out, was now recycled into devices designed to measure and heal the invisible wounds of the nuclear age it had helped to usher in. The perception of the wreck underwent a radical alchemy. It was no longer primarily a tomb, a site for somber remembrance. It became a resource, a geological deposit of a unique industrial era. Its value was no longer symbolic or historical, but quantifiable, measured in yen and dollars per kilogram on a specialized market. The Mutsu's final battle was not against the U.S. Navy, but against obscurity. Her final victory was not in combat, but in utility. The ideology that had breathed life into her keel had been scrapped, and its most durable physical remnant was now a cold commodity in the very global economic system it had once sought to destroy by force. The battleship of empire had become a mine for science. And through this entire narrative, from the ship's solemn launch at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal in 1920, through its violent dissolution in 1943, to its piecemeal exhumation in 1970, runs a single, recurring, potent symbolic object: rice. Aboard the Mutsu, it was the humble, essential staple that filled the crew's lacquered meshy bowls at every meal, the glue of communal life below decks. It represented the homeland's sacred sustenance, the agrarian, rooted heart of the Japan they believed they were protecting and expanding. It was the taste of home, the foundation of kokomotsu, the national food. In the ship's vast storerooms, it was stacked in sacks, a logistical guarantee of endurance. After the cataclysm, as the shattered halves of the hulk plunged toward the seabed, thousands of pounds of uncooked rice from the ship's sundered stores spilled from burst sacks. It did not simply disperse. Witnesses from nearby ships described a strange phenomenon, a great, billowing cloud, pale and granular, that blossomed in the water around the sinking wreck, slowly settling through the water column like a ghostly snowfall. It coated the twisted superstructure, filled the corridors, and drifted over the bodies of the fallen, forming a thick sediment layer on the seabed itself. It was a grotesque, silent parody of abundance, a nation's life-giving grain, its fundamental symbol of fertility and survival, transformed in an instant into the moldering, aquatic shroud of a tomb. It spoke not of nurture, but of catastrophic waste, of sustenance rendered sepulchral. In 1970, as the salvage divers of the Takagawa worked in the murky, green twilight 130 feet down, cutting and connecting, they reported a persistently surreal sight. This layer of rice, half a century old, preserved by the cold, anoxic deep, still blanketed vast sections of the wreck. It felt strange to the touch, not quite solid, not quite liquid, a porridge of history. It clogged water jets and filtered through cracks. It was the persistent, physical truth of the disaster. This rice was the perfect haunting countersymbol to the American mythos of boundless post-war cornucopia, the overflowing supermarkets, the endless consumer choices that became a weapon of ideology during the Cold War. Here was the opposite, the spilled, rotten, stagnant bounty of a closed, desperate, and ultimately self-consuming system. It was a literal and metaphorical fertility gone to the seabed, a stark reminder that abundance, when tied to a flawed and brutal ideology, can curdle into its own grave marker. The divers, men focused on a technical task, could not escape this symbol. They swam through it, a particulate memory of a shattered world. The Takagawa's winches finally stilled, their diesel hearts falling to an idle murmur. Turret No. 3, streaming 1,000 rivulets that caught the rising sun like tears of liquid copper, hung suspended between worlds, no longer of the sea, not yet of the land. It dripped centuries of silence onto the deck, a fossil of a dead ambition, its gun barrels empty and forever mute. The immediate operation was a triumph of maritime engineering. The steel was catalogued, sold, shipped to laboratories in Zurich and Boston. The contracts were fulfilled, the investors satisfied. But the deeper salvage operation, the one that occurs not in harbors, but in the collective memory of nations, is eternal. We raise these wrecks not merely for their scarred metal, but to salvage their meaning from the crushing pressure of forgetfulness. The Mutsu's long journey from revered imperial icon to sudden and shocking grave, to salvaged resource in a peaceful mercantile world, traces the complete arc of a fallen ideology. It proves, in iron and suffering, that no empire, no matter how fiercely conceived, no matter how encased in ritual and steel, is immutable. Its mightiest monuments, its most terrifying expressions of power, can become, in the long tide of history, mere raw material for the next age, their original intent erased, recycled, forgotten. The freedom and connected abundance of the post-war world order, imperfect and contested as it was built not solely on military victory, but on this relentless, unsentimental process of psychic and physical recycling, of taking the shattered dreams of supremacist power, the very tools of dominion, and melting them down. We forge the instruments of our curiosity from the swords of fallen gods. The turret, now cleansed, painted, and standing as a silent outdoor exhibit at the JMSDF Cure Museum, points its empty gun barrels not at imagined enemies on a horizon, but at schoolchildren on field trips, at tourists with cameras. It asks them, wordlessly, to remember that from the deepest, darkest graves, we possess the capacity to salvage not just steel, but understanding. That from the cold seabed of tragedy, we can raise hard, cold truths. The lesson of the Mutsu is not about naval engineering, nor about a singular act of sabotage. It is about transference,